Welcome. In today's episode, we will be discussing the economic calendars, the Far East, and the situation in the Middle East, all with Bob Mason of FX Empire. This is the Midweek Wrap. Hello, Bob, and thank you once again for joining us. It's been a busy start of the week on the economic calendar front, especially for the US and the UK. How are the PMI figures looking, and what can we expect?
In the early part of the week, we saw service sector PMI numbers out of the Eurozone and its member states, the UK and the US, and even China and Japan. For the Eurozone, the numbers largely reinforced what the ECB had viewed in their economic bulletin at the end of last year, that private sector activity had bottomed out and they'd expected a pickup going into the new year. The December service sector PMI hit a 4-month high for the Eurozone. It wasn't all bells and whistles, however. Obviously, Italy slid to the bottom of the rankings at the composite level. The good news, however, was that Germany picked up to, be replaced by Italy. Manufacturing sector woes continued. Of greater concern was a weaker pace of employment hiring, which hit a 5-year low. However, if we look at the numbers, phase one trade agreement between the US and China, the US MTA, all of that points to, hopes of a pickup in trade, global trade. So if service sector activity continues to perform and manufacturing sector activity picks up, then, it's looking fairly decent for the Eurozone. From the US, service sector activity impressed. The market's favorite ISM numbers delivered solid numbers, supporting the more optimistic outlook on the US economy. Even the market survey PMI numbers were revised upwards, which provided support at the beginning of the week. For the UK service sector avoided a contraction. The numbers were pretty positive from an optimism perspective, since highest level since 2018. Hopes are that Boris Johnson's victory last month will give the UK economy a boost. Service sector activity remains key for the UK economy, so that was a positive. Out of China, there was a slightly slower growth, but nothing to raise too many red flags, particularly when we're considering hopes of fiscal support, monetary policy support, and obviously the phase one trade agreement. Things were not much better out of Japan, however. We'll discuss that shortly. So all in all, more upbeat for the Eurozone, better than expected for the UK, and solid numbers out of the US.
Let's focus on the Eurozone. What figures are coming out of the Eurozone following the holidays, and how's it looking on the retail and inflation front?
On the retail sales front for the Eurozone, we saw German retail sales jump by 2.1% in November, and the Eurozone's retail sales jump by 1%, both coming well ahead of forecasts and reversing losses, downturns from the previous month of October. Decent numbers, particularly when you consider the fact that the ECB remains reliant upon, solid employment conditions and consumer spending to support the economy as manufacturing woes continue. So if we look at, the combination of a pickup in retail sales, the better than expected service sector numbers, the Eurozone's service sector saw a 4-month high, and, the phase one trade agreement between the US and China, put all that together. And, there are hopes that the Eurozone economy should at least turn the corner and see better growth going into the next year. It's going to take time for those tariffs, that are being rolled back to start taking effect. However, we've yet to sign the phase one agreement that's due next week. So it's not done yet. And obviously there's one curveball that hit the Eurozone quite hard, and that's a sudden interest from Trump on trade terms with the EU and, the threat of tariffs that could spook consumers at the start of the year. So all in all, positive for now, but we need to see where it's going through the first quarter. On the inflation front, we saw the core annual rate of inflation hold steady at 1.3%. That's still way off the ECB's objective, but there's no pressure on the ECB to make any moves near term. Lagarde's going to monitor how service sector activity and manufacturing sector activity in particular perform in the first quarter. Obviously trade terms need to improve, and economic activity out of Germany needs to begin cranking up to really support the Eurozone.
It's been a quiet start to the week in the Far East, especially in Japan and China. How do you see China and Japan picking up in the week ahead?
Service sector PMI numbers out of Japan last week were particularly disappointing. The finalized numbers for December reflected a second contraction in 3 months in the service sector, and it was quite dire numbers for the fourth quarter. The Japan economy saw the worst quarter since 2016. So manufacturing woes, sector woes, and service sector woes, painting a grim picture. Throw in, the government's sales tax rate hike, obviously the effects of the ongoing US-China trade war. Not particularly great. The Bank of Japan's managed to avoid, easing monetary policy further, despite continuous promises of delivering more. These numbers aren't particularly good. So there's a lot hanging on the phase one trade agreement delivering a boost to global trade, which will need to filter through for the Japan economy to turn around. Household spending has been quite dire, so manufacturing sector activity is really going to need to pick up to support growth and then turn into support domestic consumption as well. Out of China, we saw both manufacturing sector activity and service sector activity, the growth slow at the end of the year. Not too many alarm bells though. Obviously everyone's hoping that this phase one trade agreement is going to deliver a boost. Obviously the Chinese government's delivering fiscal support and the PBOC is providing monetary policy support to boost economic activity. So let's see what happens in the first quarter. There are still tariffs in place, even though the rollback. So how China performs against the US demands will be key in terms of economic activity improving through the quarter.
The geopolitical risk is very high on the agenda at the moment, especially with the heightened tensions in the Middle East between the US and Iran. How has this affected the markets, and will it affect the markets in the future?
Geopolitical front, it was quite a week for the global financial markets. We saw the strategic bombings by the US and then the strategic missile attacks by the Iranian government as well. Impressively, more than 12 missiles didn't cause any fatalities in bases in Iraq that were housing US military. So Trump's speech on Wednesday provided some market comfort. There's no military response immediately by the US in retaliation to the missile strikes. Trump's speech also extended an olive branch to the Iranian government and the regime to turn to more diplomatic ways of easing tensions within the region. Obviously, there's a long way to go before things materially change. Obviously, Iran needs to address its crank up in uranium enrichment to at least deliver some favorable terms going into any sort of negotiations. The nuclear agreement, obviously the US is out. The latest crank up in enrichment has, tested the EU as well and other members. Obviously Trump did highlight the need for Russia and China to be on board. The last thing Trump needs is an Iran, Russia, China alliance to go against the rest of the world. Obviously both of those wouldn't mind having a foot in the Middle East. So there's a long way to go. Tensions eased. We saw escalation and de-escalation, but I wouldn't bet my last dollar on things over just yet. The Iranian government are obviously still quite miffed at last week's events. So let's see what happens in the coming weeks. Chatter from Washington and Tehran are going to be particularly key. Expect markets to be particularly sensitive to any chatter on any possible rise in tensions. Iran's unlikely to want to give up its power across the Middle East anytime soon. They're going to want something from the US to do that. Obviously, we got heavy sanctions on Iran that have led to protests within the country. So if sanctions ease off, the Iranian government could hold face and gain the support of the people. And that's going to be needed for the Iranian government to then sit at the negotiating table with the US in particular. The threat of the possibility of sanctions being eased off, obviously that's going to suggest that oil exports will crank up and that could weigh on oil prices near term. But all in all, it's a wait and see for now. Let's see how the Iranian government responds to Trump's call to return to the table and stop the meddling within the Middle East, as it were.
Okay, Bob, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you again soon.